Alright, ladies and gentlemen, we're back to finish up Chapter 3. We're on Concept 3.3, which is all about acids and bases. And it says acidic and basic conditions affect living organisms. And the key thing we need to remember here is that water can sometimes split apart. The basic water molecule is H2O, two hydrogens and one oxygen. But sometimes, because of the hydrogen bonding going on between water molecules, one of the hydrogens can actually be shifted or leave its molecule and attach to another one. So that hydrogen atom, when it leaves its electron behind and is transferred as a single proton, that's an H plus, a hydrogen ion. So sometimes one of the H's breaks away, one of the protons breaks away from that water molecule, and that H plus ion is floating free. Now it doesn't stay floating free for very long. It will find the nearest water molecule and attach to it. So that's going to form an H3O plus hydronium ion. So sometimes the water molecule breaks apart, one of those H's attaches to a different water molecule, and suddenly you have H3O plus because it's gained a positive proton. Now this is called a hydronium ion, but the problem, or something that can be confusing, is that when we discuss this hydronium ion, we oftentimes kind of shorten what we call it. And instead of calling it H3O plus, we simply refer to it as H plus. So that may be confusing to you, but if we talk about an H plus ion, we're actually talking about an H3O plus hydronium ion. So what about the rest of that water molecule that got left behind? Well, suddenly it's OH negative. It's lost one of its positive proton hydrogens, and we call that a hydroxide ion. So water can break apart into an H plus, which will then go and attach to another water molecule, and then what's left behind is the OH negative. Now the reality is that this sort of back and forth is always occurring. It's what we call a dynamic equilibrium. And for the most part, if you have a glass of water, the vast majority of the molecules are in this H2O form that you see here. So on the left we have two H2O water molecules, and the vast majority of the water within that cup or within that glass is going to be in this state. But, like I said, sometimes one of the hydrogen protons can shift and will reconnect and form this hydronium ion, this H plus, and then here we have the OH negative hydroxide ion. Now, there's only going to be a small percentage of molecules within that cup of water that are in either one of these states, but that small percentage can be significant, especially when it's not equal. Generally speaking, you have equal amount of these two ions, plus the majority just regular water like you would expect. But if this becomes an unequal distribution, that's when you have some changes that can occur and that are very important to biology. So while this change, this dissociation, is pretty rare, it can have a pretty big effect. The concentrations of H plus, there's that H plus, remember it's actually H3O plus because that H plus is not going to stay by itself, and the OH minus, that can have a big effect on the chemistry of living creatures and the cells. Most biological processes, most living processes, can only occur within a pretty narrow range of pH. We're going to find out pH is how we measure the percentages of those H plus and OH negatives. But most living creatures and living processes of the cells in the body have a pretty narrow range, and they can't go too far up or down within a certain range. So the concentrations of this H plus and OH minus are usually generally equal in pure water, but you can add certain materials, certain solutes that we call acids and bases that will modify the relative concentrations. And so we have a particular scale that we use called a pH scale. The pH scale, to me, was oftentimes very confusing. So I'm going to try to explain it in the best way that I can. And keeping in mind, of course, this is not a chemistry course, but pH is very important, and this part of chemistry is very important to biology, so we do need to cover it just a little bit. So here we have a basic scale. An acid is any material that increases the H plus concentration of a solution. In other words, it tends to add hydrogen ions to the solution. And in our scale, anything below 7 would be considered an acid. There you can see some examples, all the way from pure water, which is neutral, all the way down to battery acids, stomach acids, things like that. The opposite end of the scale is a base, and a base is any substance that reduces the H plus concentration and that can be done by adding OH negative ions or in some other way reducing the H plus concentration. And you can see that goes from 7 all the way up to 14, where a lot of different household cleaners like ammonia and soap and bleaches tend to be on that end of the scale, what we call basic. Now to try to describe the pH scale, in any aqueous solution, aqueous means water is the solvent, at 25 degrees Celsius, the product of the H plus and the OH minus is a constant, and it can be written as what you see here. The H plus concentration and the OH minus concentration is going to be equal to 10 to the negative 14, which is an extremely small number, of course. So like I said, most of those water molecules will not be in either one of these states, but the combination of the two will get 10 to the negative 14. So pH, in the red here, the pH of a solution is defined by the negative logarithm of the H plus concentration. Similar to the way that we were using moles to help us describe and quantify large numbers of molecules, here we're going to use the logarithm of a concentration, because otherwise the numbers are so small. So pH is the negative log of the H plus concentration. So for a neutral solution where the H plus and the OH minus are equal, that would have to be negative 7 and negative 7. So we measure pH by the H plus concentration. So that right there, the H plus concentration is what we're going to actually look at. And if it's negative 7, this is negative 7 to get us our 14. That's a neutral solution. So for a neutral solution, the negative logarithm of 10 to the negative 7, that gives us our pH of 7. So I know that's somewhat confusing, but just keep in mind that this is a balance. So if we have a greater number or amount of hydrogen ions, we're going to have less OH negative hydroxide ions, and vice versa is also true. So acidic solutions tip that balance to where you have values less than 7. In other words, that means you have a greater concentration of the H plus ions. Remember, this is a logarithmic function, and it's of a negative log. So if we have 10 to the negative 6, well, that's a greater amount than 10 to the negative 7. Or if we have 10 to the negative 1, well, that's a greater amount than 10 to the negative 5. So keep that in mind. The basic solutions have a pH greater than 7. So we're moving away. We're going up to a negative 8, a negative 14, a 10 to the negative 12, above that equal mark of 7. So basic solutions have a pH value greater than 7. In biology, most of the fluids, bodily fluids and cellular fluids that we're talking about have a pH value somewhere in the 6 to 8 range. So you see, for the most part, they tend to be fairly neutral. And again, like I said, since this total concentration is a constant of 10 to the negative 14, it's a sliding scale. If one goes up, the other goes down. So if we know the concentration of one of these ions, we can derive the concentration of the other ion. So if the concentration of H plus ions is 10 to the negative 3, well, then we automatically know the concentration of the OH minus ions must be 10 to the negative 11. So we can kind of ascertain one from the other. Just to give you one last look at a kind of a pH scale, on the left-hand side, this shows the relative number of H plus ions and OH minus ions. Again, keep in mind that H plus that they show there, that's a little bit of a misnomer because it's actually the H3O plus ion, so keep that in mind. So if it's an acidic solution, say all the way down here to vinegar and acids like battery acid, lemon juice, you notice we have more of the H plus ions relative to the OH. In a neutral solution, we have about an equal concentration of each, and then a basic solution down here near the bottom. Again, a lot of our cleaners that we use tend to be very basic, household bleach and other cleaners. You notice the OH minus ions outnumber the H plus. For living things to do the processes that keep them alive, oftentimes they have to stay within a narrow pH range. And the outer environment's always changing, so they oftentimes use what we call buffers. And buffers are a substance that can kind of go between an acid and a base, and they can either affect the concentration of H plus and OH minus in a solution, and that's because generally they're an acid-base pair. that will either add H plus if necessary or take out H plus if necessary. So for example, human blood contains a carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer solution. And so you can add acids or bases to human blood and it will kind of absorb those changes and not change the pH of the blood very much. So oftentimes biological systems use buffers to try to prevent drastic changes in pH. A couple of quick examples of how pH can affect biology. One of these is called acidification. Some of the various pollutants that humans create have acidified some environments, particularly water environments. So for example, fossil fuels, the burning of fossil fuels, running our cars and factories and things like that. A large quantity of that CO2, about a quarter of that CO2 that's human generated, gets absorbed by the water of the ocean, which is a good thing in a way because that helps keep it out of the air and helps dampen somewhat the greenhouse effect. But as that CO2 dissolves in the seawater, it forms a weak acid called carbonic acid. And this whole process is called ocean acidification. And that acidification, the slight drop in pH of the ocean water, has a negative effect on a lot of the aquatic life, particularly the creatures like coral that use carbonate material within the water to calcify and produce their shells. So you have some problems, particularly in coral reefs, where the water has become slightly more acidic than it used to be. So for example, on the left you have what looks to be a more normal, healthy reef. In the center you have some dieback where the water has become acidified, and then on the right you have almost a complete dieback of the coral reef, where the coral itself is not able to build its structure, its shell structure, and it ends up dying away because of the acidification of the water. Another example is acid precipitation or acid rain. Rain itself naturally is slightly acidic because as it falls through the air, it mixes with carbon dioxide in the air and again forms that carbonic acid we were talking about. But again, some of the pollutants that humans have put out with factories and cars and things of that nature has increased this acid precipitation to the degree that it can over time have an effect on lakes, streams, and forests and the like. This is actually, in a way, over time, especially since the 70s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, this is a problem that has actually improved. Here's a map showing some of the hydrogen ion concentration, the pH of various rainfall in various areas. And again, normal rainfall is slightly acidic, but anything below, I believe it's about 5.7 or 5.4, here it is, acid precipitation with a pH lower than 5.2. So anything lower than 5.2 is considered more acidic than normal. And on this map, you can see areas where that acidic rainfall does fall. Here in East Texas, in the far East Texas area, this is, you perhaps say, in the Marshall area, that around going towards Shreveport, Louisiana. And then you can see a large portion of the northeast tends to get some of that acid rain. If you had looked at this map, say 20 years ago, it was far worse. So some of our pollution control measures that we have in place now have actually made this problem not quite as bad as it used to be. And this is another good example of acidification and how pH can have quite a big effect on biology, not just individuals or individual cells or parts of your body, but entire ecosystems and entire areas as well. All right, we're done. Water is a very cool substance. You should stop and take a break and go get you some H2O, drink it up, enjoy, and we'll see you for Chapter 4. Have a good day.